you all for being here. I want to start by reminding us of this. This is the Big Bang. So I really am giving you a complete history of branding, like complete. We're going all the way back to the Big Bang. 13.8 billion years ago, we burst forth, the universe burst forth, the universe that we know burst forth, and created everything that exists as far as we know. 380,000 years ago, we had the first visible light. The first visible light that was created started 380,000 years ago. Isn't that attractive? Scientists determined this was the earliest time of visible light. I'll show you. Earliest time with visible light. I wanted to sort of mix it up, move around a little bit, keep you interested. It's all this science stuff. So 50,000 years ago, as we're getting closer and closer to right this moment, 50,000 years ago, our brains reorganized. It was a genetic mutation, a spontaneous genetic mutation that resulted in the brain we currently have today. That scientists have called the Big Brain Bang. They also call it the leap forward because that is when our brains really took the shape that we currently have today and we moved forward into becoming the modern species that we now are. So this great leap forward was the result of all of the things that we do today that are considered cultural universals, the things that compel us to live, the things that compel us to behave the way that we do. That brain reorganization is a brain that is called the triune brain, 3 parts of the brain in one. And that 3-part brain is the reptilian brain, the part of the brain that sits right on top of the spinal cord and is responsible for all of our involuntary action, our eye blinking, our breathing, our heartbeat, all of those things are controlled by the reptilian brain. And then the middle part of the brain is also called the mammalian brain or the limbic brain. That part of the brain is responsible for all of the feelings that we have of connectedness to each other, our feelings of love. All mammals rear their offspring live. We don't hatch eggs. We don't eat the eggs unless they're chicken eggs or something like that. And then the neocortex, which is the part of the brain that all of us love. It's all about abstract thinking and poetry and music. So at that time, 50,000 years ago, that big brain bang, that great leap forward, resulted in what is called cultural universals. And that means that everybody, no matter their orientation, no matter their gender, no matter their class, their race, all people engage with these behaviors. Those cultural universals are language, art, music, cooking, and self-decoration. So very shortly after the Great Leap Forward, we started using these behaviors to create the world that we now currently live in. First, we started to craft stone tools to make it easier for the hunters and the gatherers to bring back prey for us to be able to sustain ourselves. Where it really gets interesting for us as designers is about 38,000 years ago. 38,000 years ago, the first drawings on the walls of the caves of Lascaux were drawn. And here we were, as a species, first documenting our reality. We were first documenting our memories, our behaviors, the things that we were engaged in. And I find it somewhat interesting that we've gone now to the walls of Facebook, from the walls of Lascaux to the walls of Facebook. I think those are very deliberate words that have been used. 2 months ago, I got the opportunity to see what was crafted with some of those stone tools in an effort to create environments for us to live in to protect us from varying environments, varying weather. And those are the environments in Petra, Jordan, which were environments created right into the rocks, into the mountains in Jordan that allowed us to create essentially 2- and 3-bedroom homes. And these exist, these are real. These are remnants of our history in becoming human. 10,000 years ago, we started as a species to array ourselves with makeup. Makeup was first used 10,000 years ago, but we weren't using makeup for beautification and seductive purposes. We were actually using makeup to array ourselves to be more pleasing to a higher power that we considered to be God. Now, it's interesting that we, as a species, many of us agree that there is this higher power. What we don't agree is who or what that higher power is. And so shortly after we started to array ourselves with makeup in an effort to be more pleasing to a higher power, we created symbols to signify what that relationship was. And those symbols, after we were beautified, became the first symbol to signify a belief, to signify a way of thinking. At that time, we manufactured meaning around something that we then agreed meant something. We are the only species on the planet that have manufactured meaning around a symbol and then collectively all agreed on what that symbol means. And those were our first brands, our first attempt to manufacture meaning around something that did not empirically exist. That fostered a mutual agreement that then begat a sense of belonging. Now, we didn't all agree that those symbols meant the same things, that those symbols were all inclusive, that they should be everybody's symbols. And so as a species, what did we start to do? We started to fight. We started to fight. Our first wars were religious wars because we couldn't agree on the agreement that others had about what those symbols meant. I often think that if we actually knew empirically how the universe began, we wouldn't be fighting religious wars. So what's interesting about this particular time was that we started to create flags. The first flags were used on the battlefield because there were no such thing as mass manufactured uniforms. We created uniforms way into the future. 10,000 years ago, we used flags to signify where on the battlefield we belonged. It was sort of like going to a basketball game and having the Clippers on one side and the Lakers on the other. That's how we signified where we belonged. We developed crests and shields to signify lineage. But the actual word brand doesn't show up in our history until about 1,000 years ago. 1,000 years ago, the word brand was used in the 1010 Anglo-Saxon poem Beowulf, and it literally means to mark or to destroy by fire. Cattle ranchers then appropriated that word to use as a symbol of ownership on cattle. Y'all with me? Going fast. 143 years ago, modern brands were born. Brands became legally recognized in the United States on January 1st, 1876. Anybody know what the first registered trademark in the United States was? That isn't one of my former students? Bass Ale. I think this is really quite magnificent about what this means about us as a species and about us as Americans, many of us, that the first trademark brand in the United States was not an American brand and was an alcoholic beverage. So this is the first registered trademark in the United States. And what's interesting about Bass Ale is that emblem, that piece of iconography, is still their iconography to this day. And here is the first example of product placement, official product placement. I doubt that Mene got any money for this, but you can see the Bass Ale here. And then over there on the corner. Picasso and Braque also did abstract expressionist paintings with Bass Ale. It was that popular at the time. So 1876, this was a line in the sand that ushered in an entirely new stage of branding and the branding that we now know it today. The first brands were really about consistency, they were about familiarity, they were about recognizability, they were the first piece of consumer protection. You believed that they would be safe, you expected a certain promise of that relationship when you tasted a Coca-Cola in, say, Pasadena, and then went to New York, you'd expect that that Coca-Cola would taste the same way. This was when a label was really the paramount expression of the relationship that people had with their products. And what's interesting is that people were willing at that time to pay a premium for things that were manufactured. And it's interesting how now, 143 years later, we're much more interested in paying a premium for things that aren't manufactured. Wave 2, the second stage of branding, started about in the 1920s. This is what I call the anthropomorphization of brands. This was sort of like the .com boom when everybody was registering their URLs. Now that we have the .design, we can have a little bit more ability to be differentiated. But at this point, there was very little points of difference between the second wave of brands that came out from the first. All the first wave brands were the first to market. Second wave brands were all mostly copycat brands. And so the way that they created a relationship with the consumer was actually with a character, that people could project their ideas and their hopes and dreams about what that brand could be. People were so convinced that these characters were real that somebody actually called General Mills to ask Betty Crocker's hand in marriage. I'm not joking, this is an actual ad that I was able to find that brags about the fact that this man, sight unseen, asked Betty Crocker for her hand in marriage. We go into wave 3, and this is the 1960s when a brand became a status symbol. It became an emblem that signified who you wanted to appear to others as. And so we saw all sorts of ways in which brands started to create a sense of cachet just by being associated with the brand. So we had brands like Volkswagen, we had brands like Levi's. I was a young girl in the 70s and wanted a pair of Levi's desperately. I thought that somehow having that little red tag on the back of my butt would somehow make me cooler to a group of people that I thought were cooler than me. My mother was a seamstress. We had no extra money. She had no desire to go and buy me a pair of dungarees that would be more expensive than the ones that we could get at Modell's without the tag. And because she was a seamstress, she offered to sew a little red tag on the back of the pocket for me, not understanding that that would actually be worse than not having a pair of Levi's. She finally broke down, she finally relented and bought me a pair, what I imagine was in the triple markdown area of the Walt Whitman Mall on Long Island where I was living. She came home with a pair of lime green, corduroy, bell-bottom Levi's, but I didn't care. My love affair and worship of brands had finally been fulfilled with these pair of pants that I wore every day for the rest of 7th grade. We have a brand like Nike, which is now a tribe, which is just the association with the brand gives us a sense of being fitter than we might actually be. So at this point, branding turned into belonging. It was belonging to a tribe, to a religion, to a family, and the branding demonstrated that sense of belonging, both for the people who were part of the same group, and also for the people who did not belong, people like me that felt like I was a misfit in 7th grade. That sense of not having the Levi's meant that I was inferior. 25 years ago, our world became technologized. Remember what happened? We started going online. My first email address was an AOL.com email address. What were we doing back then online? There really wasn't quite the same environment that there is now. What were we doing online? Well, some of us were shopping. Welcome to Earth's biggest bookstore. Some of us were playing games. The largest commercial enterprise online at that time was porn. 18 years ago, 6 weeks after 9/11, the world changed yet again. and this little device was born, the iPod. What happened when the iPod came out? I think we forget what happened when the iPod first came out. Yes, it's changed our worlds. Yes, it's given us a whole lot of abilities that we might not have had. But in the immediate years after the iPod came out, from 2001 to 2004, anthropologically, something really interesting was happening. I'm going to show you some newspaper articles that I found at the time. Suddenly, we were being called a culture of isolationism. The iPod was isolating us. The iPod era of personal media choices was turning us into what was being called an isolation nation. This was from a blog. I'll read it. I came across an interesting study published in the Washington Post. It says Americans are far more socially isolated today than they were 2 decades ago, and a sharply growing number of people say they have no one in whom they can confide. No one with whom we can confide in the early stages of the 21st century. It was further underlined, bold italic, in the New York Times in December of 2004. James Katz, a communication professor at Rutgers University, attributed the iPod's popularity to a trend in the American culture toward withdrawing from the public sphere or the public culture into one's private space where you can have complete control over your entertainment. The iPod psychologically depopulates social space view. It increases isolation and anomie. Now, humans are happiest. We are happiest when our brains harmoniously resonate with others. When we first have babies, babies love to have skin-on-skin contact. That's how their neural pathways are able to grow and develop in the most healthy way possible. So if in 2004 we were living in this isolation nation that we were making ourselves, this was the reason that civilization seemed to be doomed. Because of our limbic brain, because of this need we have to connect, because we're happiest when our brains resonate harmoniously with others, we did something actually rather remarkable. And in 2005, we created a way to be able to connect in the device. And the first brand that was able to do that was MySpace. Anybody remember MySpace? I see some hands. That and AOL, woohoo. Immediately after that, we went into this avalanche of brands fostering a sense of connectivity online. And it's not just online, it's offline as well. Brands like Uber, brands like WeWork, brands like Airbnb create this environment where we can actually share with a real person in real life. So people talk about how we're addicted to our phones, how we're addicted to our devices. We're not addicted to our devices. We're not addicted to our phones. We're actually addicted to the feelings that we get of connectiveness while being in our phones. So we're actually able to have our complete control over our environment while still being connected to others. But these connections now have upended branding as we know it. These connections have upended branding as we know it. And for the last 10,000 years, since those first experiences of arraying ourselves with makeup to be more beautiful to a higher power, for the last 10,000 years, brands were owned by the corporation and pushed down to the consumer. The brands that were owned by the corporations were controlled by the corporations, manufactured, marketed, designed, and sold with all the power in the hands of the corporation. But the discipline of branding, as we now get very close now into current times, the discipline of branding has changed more in the last 2 years than ever before. Branding has now become democratized. Brands can be created by anyone and shared by everyone. So what was once a top-down equation, corporations push the brand down to consumers, to people. We now have a reverse bottom-up. Brands are being created by the people, for the people, and I'm going to show you some examples of some of the most effective and powerful brands today. Brands as movements. So now I take us to November of 2016. November of 2016, 2 young women here in California in protest to some of the things that our president said about women's anatomy, created a hat that suddenly went viral. Krista Suh and Jana Zweiman created this hat as a response. And by March of 2017, became one of the most recognizable symbols on the planet. As a comparison, it took 35 years for 150 million Americans to own a television set. It took 7 years for 150 million people to own a cell phone. And it took 2 months for 150 million people to wear a pink pussy hat. So today, here we are today. I believe that branding is now a profound manifestation of the human spirit. We have the power to further our humanity with the constructs that we create and the things that we mark and the things that we make and the things that we design. The most powerful brands we're creating are not created by corporations, they're movements created by people for people. Malcolm Gladwell said, never before have we had the kinds of communications technologies in the hands of those who have the greatest desire to innovate. Who do you think that is? That is us. That is us. That is you. So let's make the world that we want with the movements and the brands that have the power to change everything. Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit about your criteria for making this list? So you've started from the very beginning and gone up to today. How did you decide what to include and maybe even more importantly, what not to include?
Well, I didn't really decide to include or not to include. What I did was look at the history of branding. I started first with all the sort of modern brands. I mean, this really came, this notion of being able to understand the history of branding started quite innocuously. My then high school aged goddaughter, and this was in, I want to say 2005 or 2006, so quite some time ago, asked me why I thought MySpace was so popular. And I didn't know. I actually thought it was really ugly and really hard to navigate, and it didn't make any sense to me. And I felt that as somebody that was working in the field of branding and heading a consultancy, that I probably should know why it was so popular. And so that led to my first body of research, which ultimately became a talk that I had been giving for the next, 10 years or so, because it was changing so often. And then that, I realized, was just the beginning. It was just the tip of the iceberg to understand how and why we create the brands that we create. I mean, I believe that branding is manufactured meaning. Brands don't exist on trees. They don't grow in the ground. They actually come from us, from our brains, from our ideas. And that manufactured meaning is then, the communication of that meaning is what I believe design is. Mm-hmm. That communication of that manufactured meaning. And most brands now have to have some type of very deliberate differentiation in order to succeed. So that is part of what we have to do as consultants, is create that deliberation, that difference, to be able to express what is unique about this particular entity that wouldn't exist without this manufactured meaning around it. So what I had to do was really look quite objectively at everything that had been happening and start to connect patterns and start to connect ideas. And it was really powerful for me to realize that when we started to self-decorate, that self-decoration was in regard to our being able to express something, not to our peers for cachet or for prestige in the way that we do now, or for positioning, which is also how we do it now, but really to be able to signal to God that we were devout. I was on a National Geographic expedition through January and was in 11 different countries. Wow. And saw Muslims, Hindus, I saw Buddhists, I saw Christians, and what was interesting to me was how completely and thoroughly devout they all were. I went to Tibet and went to Patola Palace, where all of the Dalai Lamas lay and rest. And there were people, I would say the Patola Palace is probably at least 2 or 3 times the size of the Staples Center. And there were people crawling on their hands and knees, dragging themselves. They had knee pads on to protect their bodies from the ground in 7-degree weather at 13,000 feet above sea level, which is like the roof of the world, essentially. And they were dragging themselves around in devotion to God and to the Dalai Lama. So what is this belief that we have that is so powerful to connect us to something larger than ourselves? That really began moments after the Great Leap Forward. And we still do that today. We do it in our relationship to God. We do it in our relationship to each other with symbols. We wear wedding bands. We have tattoos. We do all sorts of things to signify our connections to others. And I think that's a profoundly human thing. We're the only species on the planet that does this. We're the only species on the planet that manufactures meaning from nothing.
Yeah. So when you say manufacture meaning, I mean, a lot of times that can have a negative sound to it, manufactured.
I mean, only if you think the word manufacture is a negative one. I don't really. I mean, it's just the creation of meaning.
Yeah.
But it is very much a sheen. It's not something that, again, exists. It's manufactured from nothing.
Right.
And so I think that that requires enormous imagination. So no, it's certainly not a negative thing. It's just, I think, an accurate thing about what we do.
Yeah. So in traveling around the world in that recent National Geographic trip, what would you say is one of the biggest impacts that was made in your point of view on brands and branding?
I don't know that I would say that it had an impact on brands and branding as much as it did have an impact on why we do the things that we do, which obviously include branding. I mean, it was very interesting to me to see the level of devotion from people all over the world. Jews, Christians, Muslim, Hindu, Islam. I mean, I saw every religion in sort of full regalia.
Yeah.
And at the same time, I had recently seen a really spooky movie called Mother by Darren Aronofsky. And there's no spoilers here. In the movie, Javier Bardem plays God. And the point Darren Aronofsky was making was that God is not a benevolent being, that God is actually a narcissist that requires worship. And I thought about that a lot as I traveled, because what compels us to want to find some answers to why we're here and how we're here? And for me, I would love to know that. I can only start at the Big Bang. I'd love to be able to start even earlier to figure out how that happened and then how we got here. I mean, there's so many mutations that resulted in our being here right now in this place. And I believe that the condition of branding now reflects the condition of our culture, how we treat each other, how we talk to each other, how we label each other. These are all the very basic tenets of branding. I'm not really talking about the day-to-day shopping kind of branding. I'm talking about how we designate meaning through language and symbols and words.
Yeah. Great. So you talked about the most recent brands being driven by the people. So there's a lot of people here. What should we keep in mind if we want to be included in this timeline in the future?
Well, people talk about evil corporations. There's no such thing as an evil corporation. There are only evil people that work in corporations. The corporation also does not exist without the people. And, I often joke that somebody out there must really love powdered, peach-flavored diet iced tea, because it's still being sold. Corporations, brand managers aren't altruistically putting products out on the shelves because they have a lot of heart for them. They're putting products out on the shelves because they're expecting and hoping that people will buy them. If people don't buy them, they don't stay there, and people are like, oh, let's just hope and pray that something will change and people will realize how amazing this product is. That doesn't happen. They go away. They come off the shelf and they get discarded. So we have so much power in determining what is sold and how it's sold. Because if we refuse to buy something, if we refuse to behave in a certain way, if we refuse to behave in a way that we feel doesn't further our humanity, then those things won't exist anymore. It's only when we participate in that exchange that we then suffer the ramifications. So we suffer the ramifications that we create. Mm-hmm. So, you know, one of the things that I find so interesting about how we behave is, one of the things that we could easily do that we don't, is change the way we buy toilet paper. So there's lots of toilet paper out there.
Okay.
You know, I mean, I've worked most of my career in fast-moving consumer goods, and I spent a lot of time working on toilet paper. Really proud of that. and we can, so there's this myriad of products out there, right? Mm-hmm. There are products that are recycled paper. There are products without the tube inside. You know what people really love?
What?
Soft, white toilet paper.
Okay.
Like crazy. We can't get the majority of people to buy recycled paper. It's a little bit sort of gray or a little bit brown. People want soft white paper to touch their privates. And there's a lot of that paper in the landfill. Yeah. So that's just an easy example. You know, Michael Bierut has said that, you know, if you ask people which they'd prefer to eat, would it be ice cream or broccoli? And people will think that they should say broccoli because it's healthier, but people really want ice cream, and they're gonna pick ice cream. So we all have to sort of we have to engage in behaviors that will change things individually and then collectively, because it's only those individual changes. Now, the reason why those individual changes have so much more impact now is because we can get the word out, we can connect, and we can share and protest and make the marks that say trans rights or human rights or Black Lives Matter or Me Too or Time's Up. And the more people that do that, the more behavior that isn't in line with our beliefs will be shamed. Yeah. And that's what I hope will happen.
Great. So one last question, and I know this is one that everybody really wants to know. So congratulations on being awarded the 2019 AIGA medal. So the question is...
Thank you. It's crazy.
Where are you going to display your medal?
Are you kidding? I'm going to be like wearing it 24/7. Are you kidding? As if. It's all like, right. Does it come on a ribbon? Or
I hope so.
That's going to just be perfect. You'll just see me with it all the time now.
All right.
You know, maybe I'll put it in my hair, or, you know, put it in my, like a tattoo. That would be a good one too.
I like
that.
Oh,
yeah.
All right.
Yeah. That's how I'm going to telegraph to you that, you know, maybe
it's a symbol.
Yeah.
It's a symbol.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much,
you.
Debbie Millman.
Thank you.